In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural glass material. Now you might be wondering why we're creating a procedural glass material when Blender already has a glass shader. And also if you add the principled shader, you can open up the transmission, turn the transmission weight up, and then just turn the roughness down. So using the glass shader or the principled shader are some other methods for creating glass, but with this procedural glass shader that I'll show you how to make in the video, it has many more customizable settings, and it also has some different surface imperfections like smudges and cracks and some other roughness values. And so in this tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural glass material. However, if you'd like to just purchase this material to use in your projects, then you can find the product links in the description. But let's just go over this procedural glass material. So we first have this material scale, and this is used to scale all the textures. And so you can't really see any textures right now because they're all turned off, but this will control the size of the entire material. Then we have the glass IOR value. So for most things, you're probably just going to leave this how it is, but if for some reason you want to change the IOR value, you can. Then there's also the transparency. So if you just want to make the glass much more transparent, then you can just turn that down with the transparency. And then of course there is just a base color to change the color of the glass. But then there's also some cool surface imperfections. So there's this smudges amount. So if I turn this up, it looks like there's some fingerprints and smudges on the glass. So I could turn the smudges amount way up so you can see it much better. And then there's this smudges blending. So if you want the smudges to be blended over all the glass, you can see you can just turn that up, or you can just make it really small and the smudges are now in bigger clumps. I like to turn the smudges blending to like a 0.1 or a 0.2. And then of course this should be very subtle because it's a surface imperfection. So if you just wanted to add like a little bit of fingerprints on some glass, you could turn this to a very small number of maybe a 0.2 or maybe like a 0.4. So then we also have the crack settings. So first let's turn up the cracks bump strength. So I can turn this up and now you can see it looks like the glass is all cracked or shattered. And then you can also turn up the crack scale. So just drag the crack scale and this will change the size of those cracks. And then of course, if you want to change the size of all the textures at once, you can also drag this material scale and this will change the size of all the textures. Then we can also go to this warping here. So first we have the warping bump strength. So maybe I'll just turn this up to like a 0.2, or maybe that's even a little bit too strong. So I'll turn it to like a 0.1. So if you want the glass to look like it's kind of warped, maybe it's like a hand blown glass or some kind of other warped glass, you could just turn that up. And then also there is the warping scale, of course. So I could turn this down to maybe like a 0.2. And now there's just a little bit of warping on the glass. Maybe turn up the bump strength so you can see that a little bit better. But that is how you can change the warping of the glass. Let's go down to the next one here. So we have a few more roughness settings. So this one here is a noise roughness. So if I turn this way up, you can see it's going to add roughness to the glass, but it will have a noise texture. So this again looks like maybe some surface imperfections, or maybe it's like a dusty glass and it has lots of dust on it. You could just turn it down to a very small number, maybe like a 0.3 or a 0.4. So it just looks like a subtle surface imperfection. And then there's also this glass roughness, and this is simply one single roughness value. So this is just going to make everything more rough or more reflective. So if you just want one value to control that, you can make the entire thing more rough or more shiny. And then we have some coat settings. So this is the clear coat. So I can turn up the clear coat, and this is going to add basically an extra layer of reflections over the glass. And then I could turn up the coat roughness. So I can turn this up, and now you can see that it kind of looks like there's a tiny little bit of paint over the glass, and it kind of adds that clear coat effect. It almost looks like a car paint material because cars have that clear coat. So that's another value that you can control to customize the glass, the coat weight, and the coat roughness. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, and also the Blender Market. I'll have the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, which comes with all of my procedural materials pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. You can also purchase my procedural material packs, which are just packs of 10 materials, and you can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. The links are all in the description. So before I create the procedural material, I'll show you what I have set up in the 3D viewport if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu, I went here to mesh, and I added an icosphere. And then right after you add the icosphere, you can click right behind me on the little add icosphere settings here, and I'll turn these subdivisions up to a 5 so it is smooth and round. Let's close these settings. settings, and I can use the object context menu and shade the object smooth. And then I want to model this to a better size because in the real life scale in Blender, the default objects are a bit larger than an average human. So I'll scale this object way down to like a 0.2. So that's quite a bit of a better size. I'll press Ctrl A and I'll just apply the scale. So this is the object's new default size. Then I'll go to the add menu and let's go here and add a cylinder because I want to make a cup. We're just going to use a cup to preview the material on, but of course you can add whatever object you want. And I'll just scale this object down so it's about the same size as the other object. Let's just bring it over here and actually just kind of bring these both into the center. Let's go into edit mode of this object. I'll go to the face select. I can select the bottom face and I can bring it down and then scale it down a bit. Bring it down a bit farther, maybe scale the entire thing down a bit. I'll select the top face here and let's just delete the faces. And then I can go back to object node and I'll use the object context menu and just shade the object smooth. Now I want to give these objects a solidify modifier, and that is pretty important for the glass to actually look realistic because any type of glass in the real world is going to have some amount of thickness, but these objects don't actually have any thickness. And so because we can see through them, it'll be more realistic to add a solidify. So let's go here to the modifiers. I can add modifier. We're going to search for the solidify modifier, and then I can just turn this thickness value up. I'll just turn it up a little bit more. And I forgot to press Ctrl A and apply the scale. Now that the scale is applied, you can see the solidify is much bigger. So let's just turn the thickness way down to a small number. Also this object here, I'm going to go inside the object so I can kind of see the solidify. Let's click on add modifier and I can search for the solidify modifier. And it might be easier to go into the wireframe view so I can actually see the solidify. And then I can drag this thickness value on the solidify and I'll make it a very, very small number. All right, let's go back to the cup here. And I also want to add a bevel to the edges. So let's go add modifier and I can search for the bevel modifier. And then here on the segments, I'll turn this up to like maybe a 4. And I can also drag the amount down if I want to make it smaller. And then lastly, I want to go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a subdivision surface modifier just to smooth it out. And right here on the subdivision surface modifier, I'll turn the viewport and render levels to 1. That's looking pretty good. And I could even rotate this cup over, kind of have it rotated, something like that. And then a few more things I did to the scene. So I also added this plane here. So you can go to the add menu, you can add a plane, and you can just kind of scale it up and place it behind the objects. And I'm going to do that just so that we have a dark background. We'll be adding a dark material to this just because it makes it a little bit easier to see the glass. Then I also added a camera, and then you can move your view to wherever you want the camera to be, and you can press Ctrl Alt Numpad 0. Ctrl Alt Numpad 0 will bring the camera to your view. And then also if you press the 0 on the numpad, that'll go in and out of the camera view. And if you select the camera by clicking right up here, you can go to the object data properties of the camera, and I turn the focal length up to 80 just to kind of zoom it in because I think zooming in the focal length looks just a little bit nicer. So now let's go over the lighting and the render engine. So right over here on the render properties, I am using the Cycles rendering engine because I am going for realism, and I found that this material really does work best for Cycles. It doesn't work too great in Eevee. If you are wanting to learn how to create a really nice glass shader for Eevee, then I do have a tutorial on how to create an Eevee glass shader. You can check out that video with the link in the description. So then for the lighting of the scene, I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view. So I also added this area light right here. So if you go to the add menu, you can go to light and add an area light, and you can just rotate the area light and kind of point it up here. And so I have it kind of on the front coming down to the side, and so that'll give some nice reflections for the glass objects. And I also turn this power up here to about an 80. And then also to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections in the 3D scene, you can go here to the world properties, and I added in this Skylit Garage 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. I'll have the links in the description if you'd like to download it. And on polyhaven.com, I chose the 1K version and the HDR version when I downloaded it. So then once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then you can click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And then here on the strength, I turned this up to a 2 because I wanted the HDRI to be a bit brighter. And then also if you want to make the background transparent, you can go here to the render properties and you can open up the film tab and you can just check mark the transparent button so you can't see the HDRI in the background. And then another thing you can do is you can open up the color management settings, and on the view transform, I'm going to be using Filmic, and I'll be using the look of very high contrast just to pop out the colors and make things more contrasty and saturated. So let's go into the camera view and we'll go over here to the shading workspace, and I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the the rendered view and go into the camera view. And I first just want to add a very basic material to the background here. So I'll click on new to add a new material, and I'll just rename this to background. And then over here on the principled shader, I'm just going to make this color here a very dark gray. So that'll just give kind of a nice background, and it'll make it a little bit easier to see the glass objects. And then I will also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit, and you can go here to the Preferences. And then over here on the Add-ons tab, you can go to the Search, and you can search for Node Wrangler, and you can just enable the Node Wrangler add-on. So it's built into Blender, and I will show you how to use it in the video. So let's select the object here. We'll click on new, and you can just call it whatever you want. I'll just call it glass. And then also you want to click here and you can drag and drop the same material onto this object, or just choose the glass material. So we are going to be using the principled shader, but before we actually make it look like glass, I'm going to be adding in the other textures and plugging them into the principled shader. So let's first create the smudges of the glass. So I'll go to the add menu and I will search for the Voronoi texture. Let's drop it here. And then to use the feature of the Node Wrangler, you can hold down the Control and Shift key and then select different nodes, and that's going to preview the node on the object. And then also with the Voronoi texture selected, I'll press Ctrl T. That's going to add the texture, coordinate, and mapping nodes. And I want to use the object coordinates, so I'll put the object into the vector, and the object coordinates are going to place the textures on the objects more evenly. Also, this node setup is going to get pretty large, so I do want to keep my nodes very organized. So I'm going to click and drag to box select these two nodes here. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame. And if you select the frame, you can press F2 to add a label. And I'm going to rename this to a mapping. So we'll drag the mapping down here. All right, so let's change some of the settings of the Voronoi. So here on the F1, I'll change it to smooth F1 so that the edges are smooth. And then I can turn up the scale to like an 18. I also want to make it very detailed, so I'll turn the detail up to the max of 15. And that's what I'll do for now. Now, I do want to make it more contrasty because it's kind of hard to see. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a color ramp. And we'll put the color ramp after the Voronoi texture. And then I actually want to switch these two values of the color ramp. So I'll drag the white tab to about here, and then the black tab I'll drag kind of to about there. Now to make these smudges look more subtle and to make them look more like fingerprints, I want to distort them by a noise texture. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a noise texture, and we're going to drop the noise texture here between the mapping and the Voronoi. Let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'll turn the scale to 15 so it's smaller. Let's also turn the detail up to the max of 15, and I'll turn the roughness all the way up to 1. So now you can see it's very detailed, but I want to be able to control how strong the noise texture is affecting the Voronoi. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the mix color node, and we'll put this in between the two textures, and then I'll unplug this color here, and I want this factor of the noise texture to be going into color B. Then this mapping here, what I'm going to do is hold down the shift key and right click and drag over this wire and let go, and that's going to add a reroute. So I'll now drag the reroute into color A. So the reroute is basically just extending the node which is behind it, and it can just be used to organize the nodes better. So now here on this mix type, I want to change this to the linear light. So now I can drag this factor value, and if I turn it to 0, it's only using the mapping, so it's not using the noise. But then as I turn up the factor, it's going to use more and more of the noise texture. So I'm going to turn the factor to just like a 0.1. So now you can see it looks like these nice little smudges, and it kind of looks like some surface imperfections or maybe some dried water droplets or fingerprints. So now let's click and drag and box select all of these nodes here. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll select the frame and press F2 to add a label, and I'm going to rename this to smudges. So I'm just going to show you what the smudges are going to be doing. So we can put the color here into the roughness, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader. And this base color here, let's turn this way down just so you can kind of see what it's doing. Of course, we'll be turning this into a glass shader later, but I want to actually show you why we're creating this. So this color ramp here and the rest of these textures, these black and white values are going to determine if the glass is more rough or more shiny, because it is going into the roughness. So if I Control Shift and select the principled shader, let me just navigate around here, you can see where the smudges are, they look more rough. And so that's what we're going to be using to create the smudges or the surface imperfections on the glass. So I now want to create some noise roughness. So we're going to be creating a separate group of textures. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for the noise texture. Let's drop it down here, and I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And let's take this mapping here, we'll put that into the vector, because again, again, we want to use the object coordinates. And then we can change the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn this scale up to like a 30, and I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, and the roughness, I'll turn this up to like a 0.8. So now I want to make this more contrasty, so I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we'll put the color ramp here after the noise texture, and I can drag the black tab over just to make it more contrasty, and I'll leave the white tab where it is. Now I want to be able to control the visibility of this later in the custom node group. So what I'm going to do is go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the mix color. We're going to use the mix color to basically make a slider to be able to see the noise or not see the noise at all. So we'll drop the mix right here, and then I want the color ramp color to be going into color B. Then color A, this is going to be fully black. So now if I drag the factor, if I turn it up to 1, it's using color B, or if I drag it down, it's using color A. So we're going to use this later in the custom node group. So if it's turned up to 1, you'll be able to see the smudges, or if it's turned down, the smudges will be invisible, or that noise will be invisible. So for now, I'm going to turn it down to 0 so that you can't see it. Now also later on in the custom node group, I want one value which will just control the overall roughness, and it's not going to be using a texture. So to do this, I can go to the add menu, and I can search for the brightness and contrast, and let's stick this right here. So the brightness value, this will just make it lighter or darker. So if it's black, it'll be super shiny. If I put the color here into the roughness and control shift and select the principled shader, you can see it's now fully rough. But then as I turn the brightness up, the entire thing is going to be more rough, and it will have an even roughness. So we'll be using this later in the custom node group to control the roughness. So let's box select these nodes here. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this noise roughness. So again, just to show you what this is doing, if you have the brightness and contrast going into the roughness, now if I drag this factor up, you can see as I turn the factor up more and more, you can actually see that noise there in the reflections. So that's what we'll be using later in the custom node group. Alright, so let's now create the crack texture. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'll search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop this here. I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And again, let's plug the mapping vector into the vector of the Voronoi. Now I want to be able to control all the cracks at once, and we're going to be having a few different textures. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for another mapping node. So search for a mapping. We're going to put this mapping after the first one, but before the Voronoi. So just stick it right there. And then let's change some of the Voronoi texture settings. So I'm going to click on this right here, and I'll change it to distance to edge, and this will give us the cracks. Let's then change the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 15. Also the detail here, I'll turn to the max of 15. And the roughness I'll turn up a little bit to like a 0.52. And this lacularity, I am going to turn this up a little bit to just like a 3. So I want to have two different Voronoi textures. So I'll press Ctrl Shift D to duplicate the nodes, but keep the wire plugged up. Let me just Ctrl Shift and select this Voronoi texture, and then I can change the settings of this one. So for this one, I'm going to leave all the settings how they are, except I want to turn the scale to a 30. So change it to a 30. So then we're going to be mixing both of these together to add more cracks. So I'll go to the add menu, and to mix them together, we're going to add a mix color so we can mix multiple colors together. So let's drop the mix here. And then I want to put this one into color A, and then the bottom one, we're going to put that into color B, and I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So then let's take the mix here. We're going to change it to darken. So it'll just add the dark values, and I can turn the factor all the way up to 1. So now I can see we're just mixing the large cracks and the small cracks together. Now I want to make this much more light and more contrasty. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. We'll put the color ramp here after the darken. And then if I just drag the white tab way over, I can make it very, very contrasty, and I'll drag it way over to about there so that the cracks are much smaller. Now I want to make these cracks look more random, and so I'm going to be distorting them with a noise texture. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. We'll drop the noise texture right here, drag this over, and I want to plug this color here for now. I'm just going to plug that into the vector of this one so that the noise texture color is going into both of the Voronois. So you can see now it's distorted, and let's change some of the noise texture settings. So I'll turn the scale to a 20, also turn the detail up to the max of 15, and I'll turn this roughness up to like a 0.6, so there's more more roughness. Now, the noise texture is distorting it way too much, and so I want to make it more subtle. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the mix color. Let's just drop this up here, and the mix type here, I want to change this to the linear light. So let's drag these nodes back, and for now, I'm just going to unplug these Voronoi here from the noise. So I want to take the noise texture color, and I'm going to put that into color B, and then this mapping vector, this can go into color A. So this way, we're mixing between the mapping which isn't distorted and the noise which is distorted. So then this linear light result can go into both of these vectors so that it will actually control that and distort it. So now I can drag this factor around, and if I turn the factor to 0, it's not distorted at all. And then as I turn the factor up, it's going to be more and more distorted. So I'll turn the factor to like a 0.01. So now if I zoom in there, you can see there's just a little bit of noise over those cracks, and that looks a bit better. So I'll box select all of these nodes here. I'll press Ctrl J to join that together into a frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'll just rename this to crack. Now I want to put these cracks into the bump. So what we're going to do is go to the add menu, and we're going to search for the bump node, and let's drop this here. We're actually going to stick it here after this color ramp, and then let's maybe drag the mapping back and drag the cracks back so we have a bit more space here. So then to convert the color data into bump data, the color needs to be going into the height via the bump, and then the bump normal, that can go into the normal of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So you can see now it's adding those cracks, and I do want to make the cracks much more thin. So if I go here to this color ramp, it is going to be very subtle. So let me just drag this out here and drag the color ramp out. So if I zoom way in now, you can see just by dragging it a little bit, because it's so small now, it's very contrasty. So I'm going to drag this way down so that those cracks are very thin. You can make them even thinner if you want, but I think something like that is pretty good. All right. And then also this bump strength here, this will be used to change the strength of the cracks. For now, I'm going to turn the strength to 0 because we'll be adding it to the custom node group, and then we can just add the cracks if we want to. And then the last group of textures that I want to create is the warping. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm just going to search for a noise texture, and then let's take the mapping vector here, and I can plug that into the noise texture vector. Let's also hold down the shift key, and then I can right click and drag over this wire and let go, and that's going to add a reroute, and I'll drag the reroute back here just to keep my nodes more organized so the wires aren't overlapping. And then we can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it, and let's change a few of the settings. So the scale, I'm just going to turn this to like a 10, but then I will leave the other settings how they are. So I want to also add a bump node. So I'll go to the add menu. We're going to search for a bump node to convert the noise texture into bump data. So we'll drop the bump node here, and we want the factor to go into the height value of the bump. So let's drag the bump right here. We can drag that over. Let's also bulk select all of these, and I'll press Ctrl J. Ctrl J will join it together into a frame, and maybe I'll make it a little bit smaller, something like that, but I don't want the wires to be overlapping, so I just want to make it look a bit nicer. And I'll select the frame and press F2, and I'll rename it to warping. So now I can take this bump normal here, and I'm going to put it into the normal of this bump, and that way we can mix multiple bump maps together. So I can Control Shift and select the principled shader so you can see what it's doing, and this bump node way down here on the warping, probably turning it to just like a 0.1 or a 0.2 will work well, but I'm actually going to turn it to 0 so that we can just add it if we want it in the glass. So now we can actually make this material look like glass. So we'll go back to the principled shader, and this base color here, I want to turn this all the way up to 1, and then let's open up the transmission, and we'll turn the weight of the transmission all the way up to 1, so now it looks like glass. Now I want to mix in the smudges so that we can control the smudges if we want to. So I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for the mix color, and we'll drop the mix color here after the brightness and contrast, so stick it there. And then the smudges, and this is going to go into color B, and then the brightness and contrast, that's going to go into color A. So then we can take this mix type here, and I want to change it to add because we just want to add the values. So if I turn the factor down to 0, you can see they're gone, but then as I turn the factor up, it's going to add those smudges. So if I Control Shift and select the add so you can actually see what it's doing, we can turn this up and down just to add it. So we're just adding the smudges here, which are on the top. However, we can still add this noise roughness by turning this up. So if we wanted to add both of them, now I can Control Shift and select them, and you can see it has both of those values. So the noise roughness and then also the smudges. So that's how you can control each one of those. All right, so we can now join it together into a custom node group. So let's click and drag to box select all these nodes. I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group, and you can hit the tab key to go in and out of the node group. So I'll drag the node group right back over here. We'll drag the material output over here as well. Let's just make this a bit bigger, and I can just rename it to glass or whatever you want to call it, procedural glass or whatever you want to call it. Let's go back into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open the side panel, and I'm going to go here to the group tab and then go to the interface, and I'm going to double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to shader because I like that a bit better. So now let's add all the custom values. So I first want to be able to control all the textures at once. So because this mapping node is plugged up to all the textures, we'll use this scale. So we'll put the scale into the extra socket here. I can click on the scale, double click on it to rename it, and I'll just call it material scale because it's controlling the entire material. And then you can see that it's 3 values right now because the X, Y, and Z, but I just want to make it one single value. So let's click on the type here, and I'm going to change it to float so it is 1 value, and the default value I'll turn to 1. Then I can go outside of the node group and I'll turn this material scale back to 1, which is the default. All right, let's go back into the node group. Now I'm going to take the group input and I'm going to drag it way over here, over to the principled shader. And I want to control the IOR. So I'll put the IOR into the extra socket. I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to glass IOR. And then I also want to control the transparency. So this alpha, we'll put that into the extra socket, and I can rename this to transparency. And then I also want to control the base color. So I'll put the base color here into the extra socket, and I'll just leave it called to base color. And then I want to control the amount of smudges. So this factor value will turn up the smudges. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket here, and I'll rename it to smudges amount. Then let's take the group input and I'll drag it right back over here. And this smudges linear light, this is going to control the blending of the smudges. So real quick, if I go outside of the node group and turn the smudges amount up to 1 and go inside the node group, we can now drag this up and you can see that's going to blend it. So we'll take the factor and put that into the extra socket, and I can rename this to smudges blending. All right, so I'll go back out of the node group, and for now, I'll just turn the smudges amount back to 0. We'll go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the cracks, so I'll just drag the node group way down here. And I first want to control the crack scale, and this mapping here is plugged up to all the textures. So I'll put the scale into the extra socket there, and then I can double click on this and I'll rename it to crack scale. And then again, we need to click on the type here and change it to float so it is 1 single value. On the default value, we'll turn that to 1. We'll hit tab to go out of the node group, and the crack scale will turn that to 1. And then I can go back into the node group, and I also want to be able to control the bump strength. So we'll take the bump from the cracks and we'll put that into the extra socket. Double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to cracks bump strength. Then I want to be able to control the warping scale. So we'll take the noise texture scale, put that into the extra socket, double click on it, and we'll rename it to warping scale. And then also I want to be able to control the warping bump strength. So we'll put the strength into the extra socket, double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to warping bump strength. Then I want to be able to control the noise roughness. So if I drag the group input right back up here to the roughness, we have this value here, this factor, and I can turn this up and that'll add the noise roughness. So I'll put the factor into the extra socket here. I can double click on it and rename it to noise roughness. Then I want to be able to control the glass overall roughness. So not a texture, but just the overall roughness of the glass. So this brightness and contrast will make it brighter or darker. So we'll plug the brightness into the extra socket there, and I'll rename it to glass roughness. Now, if I go outside the node group and if I drag the glass roughness, you can see it's very, very sensitive. Just by turning it up to a 1 or a 2, it's already really rough. So I'll go back into the node group, and to make it more subtle, let's go here to the brightness and contrast. I'll go to the add menu, and I'm going to add a math node. So we'll put the math node here right before the brightness, and then you can drag this over just so that there's a bit more space. And on the add here, I'm going to change the type to divide. Then this value here, I can turn this way up to like a 40, or you can make it whatever value you want. If you turn the value up more, it's going to be more subtle when you're changing the value. So now if I go outside of the node group, you can see this glass roughness here. If I drag it, it's going to be much more subtle. So to make it really rough, I have to turn it all the way up to like a 20 instead of just turning it up to like a 1 or a 2. So that's a nice way to make the value more subtle so it's easier to drag and control. Let's go back into the node group. So then the last values that I want to control are the coat or the clear coat. So let's click on the group input. Let me just drag it right over here and I'll zoom in and we're going to open up this coat here. So we have this coat weight here and then also we have the coat roughness. So we'll turn these down to 0 for now. So I'll put the coat weight into the extra socket and the coat roughness, put that into the extra socket. All right, I'll hit the N key to close the side panel. Let's click on the group input. Let me just drag it back here. I just want to drag it to the end. And I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group. And let me just make this bigger and we can now review the finished glass material. So we have the material scale when you can see the textures. We also have the IOR value if for some reason you want to change that. And then just the transparency if you want to make the glass really transparent. We also have the base color of the glass, but I'll just leave it to white. We also have the smudges amount and then the smudges blending. So that's pretty cool. I'll turn that down. We also have the cracks bump strength. So I can turn this up and now you can see it looks like the glass is cracked or shattered. And you can also change the scale of that. Then we have the warping. So you can just turn that up a little bit and you can see the glass now looks like it's kind of warped. And then there is the warping scale. Then there is this cool noise roughness. So this makes roughness, but it has a noise pattern. And then this is just the glass roughness. So it makes the entire thing more glass. So if you wanted to make it look like a frosted glass, so it is more rough and you can't see through it, you could turn that up. I'll turn it back to 0. And then we have the coat weight, which is going to add an extra layer, kind of like an extra layer of shininess. And then you have the coat weight roughness. But I will turn these back to 0. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to purchase this finished procedural material, you can get that with the links in the description. You can also purchase all of my materials by checking out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack, and you can also get all of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist. Again, the links are all in the description. But I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.